Good evening, guys. I'm so glad that you could join me tonight to talk about self regulation and how we can help our children stay calm, cool, and in control. I'm Allison Douglas, and I will be leading our webinar tonight with the help of Cindy here at Harmony Family Center. I want to go ahead and do some housekeeping before we begin and let you know that you will be receiving certificates of participation from the session if you attend at least an hour and 15 minutes of tonight's 1 hour and a half presentation. Also, you will be receiving certificates in the name that you registered in. If there are two people or even three watching from the same device, please make sure that you send me an email or send Cindy an email and let us know the names of everyone who is watching from that device. And the earlier that you do that, the better, and the quicker that you will get your certificates. Also, check your clutter inbox or your junk mail inbox. If you don't see a certificate within the next 2 weeks, the certificates will come from an email with my name on it, Allison Douglas. So just make sure that you check all of those boxes. There are hundreds of folks joining us tonight. And so those go out in fairly large batches. And sometimes what happens is that it goes to your clutter or junk mail email and folks can't find it, and it just takes them a little while to get situated with their certificates. It may take a couple of weeks for them to get to you, but please know that we are working hard to help you stay current with your training hours if you are a foster family, and that is something that Harmony really wants to provide for you guys, along with just some really solid information about how we can meet our kids' needs. So again, I'm Allison Douglas. I'm the Training and Education Coordinator at Harmony Family Center. We are based out of Knoxville, Tennessee. And I came to the world of child welfare first as a teacher. I'm a certified Montessori directress, working with children from ages 3 to 6. Then as a foster parent, you can see in the photograph, a picture of my family. My husband and I have 4 children, all who we adopted through the Tennessee foster care system. And then I became a foster parent trainer. So I really like mixing that scientific background, the hard information, with information that we can use on a daily basis. We can't parent simply from theories. We have to know what it looks like. So I'm going to spend some time tonight really talking about how we help our kids learn to self-regulate, how we help them build those skills, and what we can do to make sure that our children are growing and developing in the most optimal ways possible. This information really comes from a variety of sources. Our lens at Harmony Family Center is Dr. Bruce Perry's neurosequential model of therapeutics. And so we will be referring to his work a great deal tonight. We also will spend some time looking at the whole brain child, and then very specifically, a really lovely book by Dr. Stuart Shanker called Self-Reg, How to Help Your Child and You Break the Stress Cycle and Successfully Engage with Life. And so I'll be referring to all 3 of these sources and probably plenty of others, because we really stand on the shoulders of giants as foster parents. The work has been done. What we need to do is figure out how it applies to our families, and then how we can bring those theories and techniques into the lives of our children to make our families run more smoothly and calmly. We're going to watch a short video from the Harvard Center for the Developing Child. This video is called Building Core Capabilities. Okay, guys. So thank you for watching that video with me. I really love the resources that come out of the Harvard Center for the Developing Child. I feel like they take some really challenging and big concepts and put them together in a way that helps me to understand them so beautifully. And so this video talks to us a lot about building these core capabilities, building the ability to function in a world that we really can't control as much as we would like to sometimes. So this is really the definition of what self-regulation is, how we function in an unpredictable world. There are varying definitions of self regulation, and it's often used interchangeably with the idea of executive functioning. But this is the core, this is what we are going to use as our basis for what is self regulation. Self regulation is the ability to manage our emotions and behavior in accordance to the demands of the situation. And we know that there are times and places it's appropriate to behave in one way, and yet, in another time and place, it is not appropriate to behave in that exact same way. It's the same with emotions. We know we can maybe cry at home in a way that we might not do in a social situation with many strangers. And self regulation gives us the ability to determine what situations we are in and how to act in those situations. Self regulation is the ability to resist highly emotional reactions to upsetting stimuli. It's the ability for us to self soothe when we're distressed. And we will call that throughout this presentation self soothing and distress tolerance. Those are really the same thing. How do we deal with really distressing situations or feelings? How do we take care of ourselves in those situations? Self-regulation involves the ability to adjust to changes in expectations and to handle frustrations appropriately. And this is a real challenge for many people, not just traumatized children. This is a challenge for a lot of folks, is how do we adjust once our mind is set on having something happen or having it happen in a certain way? How do we cope when those expectations change? And then how do we handle our big feelings about that? Self regulation is also the ability to direct our behavior towards a goal in age appropriate ways, right? A teen could have goal setting behavior that would look very different than a 4 year old or a 5 year old. But we want our kids to be able to set goals, to direct their behavior towards those goals, even though the world around them is unpredictable, even though our own feelings may change and become unpredictable. So this is really our working definition of self-regulation for the rest of today. This can be a real hang up for a lot of folks. Recently, in our adoption support group, we talked about self regulation, and one of the dads said, "Oh, I get it. It's just what we used to call self control." And he was on the right path, but not quite there. Self regulation is not the same as self control, they're a bit different. Self control is inhibiting our strong impulses, right? So, this lady in our photo really is interested in this dessert, and she is trying her hardest. She's white knuckling it there on the counter, inhibiting that strong impulse to have the dessert that's unhealthy for her. That is self control. Self control is inhibiting urges. Self regulation goes much further than that. Self regulation involves us reducing the intensity and the frequency of these strong impulses. And it does this by teaching us and having us manage our stress load and how we recover from having a large stress load. You know, humans have a finite amount of mental energy. And so self regulation is helping us understand how to allocate that mental energy and learning how stressors deplete that energy. And so we want to think moving forward that self control is part of self regulation, but self regulation goes much deeper than that. Um, my own son, about 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, at age 10 and a half, went to go get a speech assessment. And he had the speech assessment because he was having a lot of challenges in school. He was unable to pay attention. He would get tired, at 10 and a half years old in fourth grade. He would get tired after a few hours working at his desk and fall asleep or lay down and put his head down. And of course, teachers were not really excited about that. And what they saw was this kid that was just kind of lazy, he's kind of slow. He didn't try very hard. But what we found is during this speech assessment, the speech pathologist did a short test, and she would say a sentence and then have my son repeat it back to her. And he was able to do that fairly well for pretty short sentences, sentences that weren't very complex, that didn't have a lot of complicated language and were fairly directive. And so he did that very well. And then she moved on to the next step of this, and she asked him to repeat sentences that had a variety of steps involved. And so I was sitting in on this assessment listening, and the speech pathologist said, "Mike, I want you to repeat this back to me. Go to your desk, take out your folder, put your math work in the basket, return your folder to the desk, and meet me at the door." And so I watched my son. He sat there for a minute, and he said, "Get your folder?" And he just sort of looked questioningly at her, and he could not repeat back to her this pretty complex piece of information. And what that did is it just sent this light bulb through my head. This is what my kid is doing every day at school. He's getting a lot of complex information, and he cannot sort of sift through that and determine what he needs to do first. So first of all, he's going into the classroom. He's having trouble remembering what the teacher said. Everyone's putting away their backpacks and binders, and it's quite loud, and he has a challenge with that, right? And so his whole morning is him trying to manage a stress load and really not succeeding very well. And so what Mike needed to learn, and what Mike has learned, is how do you self-regulate when there is this chaos going on around you? How do you manage that stress and recover from that stress? So Dr. Schenker writes in the book Self-Reg, the brain adapts to protect itself from the stress that trauma produces. Certain parts of the brain are placed on high alert, while other parts become much less active. This has a significant impact on a child's ability to control emotions, stay calm, pay attention, be less impulsive, and form healthy relationships. Even fairly ordinary events like going to a supermarket or sitting in a classroom, right there is my son, can be very hard for a child that has experienced the effects of trauma. And so what we can do as parents and as caregivers is just really explore a little bit about how trauma can have an impact on self-regulation in our children, and how their trauma history can play a role in how they physiologically, how their body copes with stressors. So let's take a look at what that looks like. If you were with us on our ACEs call a few weeks ago, you may remember that we talked about the ACEs study. And I don't want to do a whole ACEs lecture right now, but I do want to get those folks up to speed who maybe don't know a lot about the ACEs study. So the ACEs study was done in the mid-90s by a doctor named Vincent Felitti. He worked at a bariatric clinic, and he noticed that a incredibly high percentage of the folks that came to him for bariatric surgery and who were morbidly obese had a trauma history in their early childhood. Many of them had sexual abuse in their early childhood. And so he did what scientists do, which is ask the question, is this related? And then he did some experiments to find out if it was related. These tests, the study was called the ACEs study. And you see in pink there at the bottom of our pyramid, ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. These bad experiences were divided into about 10 categories. They encompass things like physical and sexual emotional abuse, physical neglect, emotional neglect, observing violence between caregivers, a parent who's incarcerated, parents with drug and alcohol abuse issues, families who are divorced. And so what he did is he looked at this study of folks who had these ACEs or who had these experiences in their childhood and then compared them to their records of health and well-being as an adult. And what he found was what we now call the dose-response relationship. And what that means is the higher dose of adversity that we have in our childhood, the lower our health and well-being scores are. So the more bad things that happen to us in childhood, the less well we are doing in our physical health, our mental health, and well-being. And so what this means is that trauma impacts our development overall. It impacts our emotional health, mental health, and physical health, as well as our development. And so this experiment has been replicated multiple times, all with the same outcomes, that there is a dose-response relationship between trauma in early childhood and poor health and well-being outcomes for adults. And so why do many of our kids have lagging self-regulation skills? Because trauma has simply impacted their overall health and development. You'll also remember that early trauma has a huge impact on the developing brain. So this is Dr. Perry, Dr. Bruce Perry, who has created the neurosequential model of therapeutics and written many books, and also recently in the last few weeks appeared on 60 Minutes with Oprah. He says the majority of brain organization takes place in the first 4 years of life. This is why trauma and neglect have such a disproportionate influence on brain organization and later functioning when they occur in the first 4 years of life. So what this means is that early trauma impacts the brain in ways that trauma that happens to us later in our lifespans does not. Here's why. The brain develops in a very specific sequence as we grow. It begins at the brainstem, which we see is that pink part of the graph here. It begins at the brainstem, and then the brain grows upward from there. So in the earliest parts of childhood, if the child does not have appropriate nurturing caregiving, that brainstem becomes really disorganized and weak. It's very unhealthy. And everything that builds on top of that is then less and less sound. So the brain is impacted from early trauma because it builds from the bottom up. Like a house, the brain needs that strong foundation to support the development of these higher level thinking skills. So let's look at what each part of the brain does quickly. The bottom part of the brain, our brainstem, that really takes care of a lot of the things that keep our body running. It takes care of our heart rate, that fight, flight, or freeze response that we have. And so that is the first part to develop. And often if there is in utero exposure to drugs or alcohol, if there are other prenatal insults or very, very early neglect or abuse, the brainstem has not developed in a healthy, organized way. On top of that brainstem is the midbrain, or what we call the diencephalon. This is more about things like sensory integration, coordination, movement, sleep, how we deal with the outside world, things like eating. And so again, if we have challenges in the brainstem, just like that faulty foundation, what goes on top is simply not going to be as strong. On top of the midbrain, the limbic part of the brain begins to grow. This is very roughly the area where we see things like emotional response. There's a lot of self-regulation that happens in the limbic brain and the cortical brain, which is our highest level of thinking skills and grows on top of the limbic area there. So again, when the brain grows in a bottom-up fashion, what is done earliest in childhood and prenatally can actually cause a cascading effect as the child grows. So when the brainstem isn't strong, neither is the midbrain, which controls things like our sensory inputs, our sleep. Then our emotional area may be a bit weaker than a typical kid's. And then on top of that, the cortical area, which is where we really see a lot of the things that we're asking kids to do on a daily basis, like have self-control, remember a great deal of information and put it to use in a new way. That is also simply not as strong. So poor early experiences create a brain that is simply not organized in an optimal fashion. And so trauma impacts our children's neurological development. Poor early experiences also create a brain that is wired for fear. As a brand new foster parent, I so wish that I knew this information, because I feel like I did things in a way that really didn't help my kids as much as I could have. But as we say, when you know better, you do better. And so I want us to really think about this idea that trauma wires our children's brains to be in a state of fear and then act out of this knowledge. So when kids experience traumatic stress, their bodies primarily react in two ways. So the first way that they typically react is hyperarousal. And we call this fight or flight. And we know these kids, we've seen these kids. These are kids that go to a birthday party. The minute that they hit the door, it is total chaos. They run and hide behind the couch, or they run out the door when they hear a loud sound. They're just really very aroused physically and neurologically. So hyperarousal is one way that children react when they have stress in their life, chronic toxic stress. A second way that our children react under this kind of chronic stress is the freeze reaction. And this is called dissociation. The freeze reaction is often what happens when children are too small to fight or fly. You know, an infant in a lot of distress can't run away and it can't fight, so it falls asleep or it just goes limp and stares at the wall. And so many of our kids who were hurt in their very earliest years find themselves in this pattern of freeze. So when there is trauma, our kids will react typically hyperarousal or dissociation. And both of these states produce a very specific chemical and neurological reaction in the body. And when those stress responses are repeated over and over again, so in the white square there, repeated unpredictable violence, repeated unpredictable pain for children, their brain becomes very, very sensitized to this stress. And it begins to take less and less stimulus to activate a full-on hyper-aroused situation or a full-on dissociative situation. And what we see as caregivers is kids who are triggered by really, really minor things into full-on trauma responses. And so a child who sees a certain poster or smells a certain food, but goes into a full-on trauma response, a meltdown, they fight with you, they push you, they try to run away, right? And so when the brain gets very sensitized, it's actually wired for fear. Tiny things trigger the brain and body to have a trauma reaction. So the thing is, this can also happen with experiences that aren't even stressful. Our brains are really amazing, and they're primarily designed just to keep us alive, and they do a great job of that. But what that does is that makes them a little bit lazy in some ways. And so once something happens over and over again, our brain kind of creates this quick trigger, this hair trigger, and says, "Yep, I know what this is, and I'm going to take care of you." And so when children have been very stressed out and they have this very quick trauma response, something like a new experience will be interpreted by their brain and body as a threat. And so this happens before the child is even fully aware of what's going on, right? They've responded before their cortex has a chance to come online and say, this is not really scary. There's nothing bad going on here. It's just new. And so we see the results of this in parenting all the time. Again, as a brand new foster parent, I really wanted to do everything right for my kids. I wanted them to enjoy the world and enjoy life. And so I gave them all these new and exciting experiences. And they were really very unsuccessful because their brain and body were saying these new experiences may be threatening. And so they were responding in ways that made their behavior less than acceptable in those situations. And so trauma wires our kids for fear. And when we talk about self-regulation, we are talking straight up about how we react to stress. And so children who have this kind of trauma background really have a very, very poor stress management system neurologically. We know that trauma makes life pretty challenging for our kids, but there are even some studies that indicate some very specific ways that trauma can damage self-regulation. This again comes from the Harvard Center of the Developing Child, talking about neglect. And this graph you see is looking at children's ability to be creative and to be confident and assertive. And this is a study that was done with children who were 3.5 years old. Some of them had experienced no maltreatment, others had experienced very specific types of maltreatment. And what this researcher did was give the children something called a barrier box. So it's basically a toy, a box that's designed to be very challenging to open. And they put a fun toy inside the box and then gave the box to the children and said, get the toy out. So then they observed these kids' efforts to solve the puzzle and to get the toy out and rated their scores about how much time they spent and how they behaved during that. So kids who had maltreatment, verbal abuse, physical abuse, and neglect all fared so much more poorly in the ways that they creatively engaged with the toy. And that is all about flexible thinking, right? How do we solve a problem? So kids who have gone through maltreatment, even by 3.5, had significantly lower scores on being flexible and creative in solving problems. In the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Journal, there's another article about childhood maltreatment and executive function in adolescents. So we were looking at preschoolers before. Adolescents who had maltreatment, abuse, and neglect in their early childhoods scored lower on visual and verbal processing speeds. And so this can deeply influence their executive functioning, right? So when we think about the story of my son going into the classroom and getting a lot of information, he was not even processing all of that information, which made him then problem solving and following directions became very challenging for him. So abuse and neglect can even change the visual and verbal processing speed of children. Let's look at one more. I found this incredibly fascinating. This is from a book called New Directions in Child Abuse and Neglect Research. And this is about social engagement and being able to look at other people, to assess and change behavior based on what the child sees and understands. And this was about processing emotional cues by looking at people's faces. And this researcher says that abused children's bias toward attributing angry or sad affect probably helped them when they lived with parents who were angry, and seeing an angry face created a threat cue, right? Oop, I need to protect myself because dad looks mad. But what happened then is the same children then, in a very typical situation, a benign situation, maybe a classroom, maybe at the park, would look at a face that was not hostile and assume that there was hostile intent. And we call this a negativity bias. What this means is that children who have dealt with a lot of abuse, a lot of neglect, will see a neutral face as being more negative, and then will respond as if that face were negative. So again, it comes at the cost of assuming hostile intent too readily under benign conditions, which leads to aggressive responses that would not have been evoked had these children seen the faces for what they really were. And this is something that I think we really have to look at in our children. I've so many times just been maybe sitting at the desk working on bills or working on a lesson plan, and one of my children will say, "Why are you mad at me?" To me, I just have a neutral expression, but they read that as an angry expression or an upset expression. And thankfully, my kids are now at the point where they can verbalize this and say, "What's going on? Are you upset? Are you mad?" But very early on, they would often respond through behavioral cues, saying, "I'm upset with you," instead of asking me if I were upset with them. So we know that early trauma absolutely changes how children interact with the world, how their brain and body grows, and then certainly that's going to affect self-regulation. So when we look back at our definition, self-regulation is about controlling emotions. It's about resisting really emotional reactions to upsetting stimuli, which that stimuli might even be a neutral face. It's about that ability to self-soothe when a child is distressed. And we have seen from the information about the brain, even a fun new situation can cause our child to be distressed. It's the ability to think flexibly, to adjust our expectations. Again, we've seen the science bears out that this can be really challenging for children who have faced maltreatment. And then again, to have goal-oriented behavior. And that's quite challenging when you are so busy simply trying to understand the world, to process what you are hearing, to follow directions, and to control your impulses. It's quite challenging to have that kind of goal, right? Self-regulation is all about reducing the frequency and intensity of impulses by managing stress and recovering from stress. And for the children that we parent, this is an absolute Herculean task from day to day, sometimes from hour to hour, depending on our children and their stressors and their challenges. So let's look at what a child dealing with executive functioning and self-regulation challenges may look like in the home or the classroom. So here's a schedule, and we didn't even get through the school day. We stopped right before lunch with this child. This is Victoria. She's 11. Victoria was adopted through foster care at age 3.5. Her first 3 years were spent living in various homeless shelters and cars with her biological mother, who loved her very much and did the best that she could. But because she was struggling with mental illness and drug addiction, Victoria was left alone quite a bit. She was not fed on a regular basis. and she was not taken care of or nurtured appropriately. And so she has many health, educational, and mental health behavioral challenges. So Victoria wakes up at 5:15 a.m. She disturbs the entire family by banging around the house, is how this parent described it. And after some discussions that happened much later than 5:15, Victoria says she just didn't know what else to do because no one else in the family was awake at 5:15. At 7 a.m., she can't find the shirt that she's been planning to wear to school all day. So she sits on her bed facing the wall, ignoring her mom's request to choose another shirt. 45 minutes later, she heads to the school office to turn in her permission slip, but she's distracted by a group of friends and ends up in the cafeteria, leaving her permission slip on the table in the cafeteria. By 8:15, she attempts to run out of her classroom when she sees that her math teacher is a substitute. When the teacher calls her out, she responds to the teacher by saying, "I don't like you and I won't do anything you say." Later in the afternoon, she has a disagreement with her friend over some erasers that they're trading. She puts her head on her desk and refuses to do any more work. Right before lunch, Victoria remembers something that her grandfather told her, and she blurts this out during instruction. When the teacher simply doesn't respond to her, she repeats it more loudly. So my guess is that you know Victoria. You may know lots of children like Victoria, or live with Victoria, or lots of children like Victoria. And so we know what this looks like. But what does this mean when we want to think about these poor behaviors in terms of executive functioning? So disturbing the family in the morning may be about Victoria's lack of skill to self-soothe. My children are early risers. I am not an early riser. It took years of me being a grumpy early riser to teach them how to self-soothe, how to be okay, maybe alone, playing with each other, or even playing in my room quietly. It took years, and there are still mornings that my children wake me up because being alone, self-soothing, dealing with that distress is so challenging for them. They need adult intervention. You know, she can't find her shirt. This was the shirt she planned to wear. Having that cognitive flexibility, the ability to change her plan midstream, it's really challenging for Victoria. And so with a little more cognitive flexibility, this kid may be able to overcome behavior like this. Focus, getting distracted by the environment. That's huge for many of our children. Some of this may be cognitive, that they're just involved with friends, they want to go off with friends, but it may be quite overwhelming to be in a situation where you go from the quiet home to the car to a school, which is quite loud. And this is something I certainly didn't realize as a parent. I had always taught in Montessori schools, which were very quiet and sort of low key and calm. But my kids went to public school. And the first day that I went into the school building, it it really was very shocking to me how loud it is. There's a lot of echoing. There's a lot of overhead lights that are very bright. They may be flickering. They may be making noise. And so for this child to focus in such a situation, again, is pushing that boulder up the mountain for her. Attempting to run away from her class when she is a sub, you know, that's a flexibility problem. Being able to go, oh, Miss Jones is my math teacher. Now I come to class and it's Mr. Smith. That's about flexibility and managing that upset, managing those emotions, managing that distress that she's feeling. The same with having a disagreement over a friend. With a friend over trading, you know, she is unable to manage her big feelings, so she just shut off. Done with school, done with the day, I'm putting my head down because this happened with my friend. So this kid is really unable to move on in a way that allows her to be flexible and to manage her emotions. And then impulse control. Oh boy, impulse control is such a challenge for so many of our kids. She remembered something her grandfather told her. It was important. She wanted to share. She wanted to connect with her teacher. She needed to tell this, but she didn't and doesn't have the skills to know that now is not the time, and doesn't have the skills to understand that when the teacher is ignoring her, it's not because she can't hear her, it's because she needs to go on with her tasks. And so what we are seeing here are lots and lots of problem with self-regulation in Miss Victoria. So once we can sort of identify that a lot of our children's, quote, bad behaviors are really problems that they're having with self-regulation, how can we, as invested adults, as a parent, as a teacher, as a clinician, how can we help children to develop, to grow these skills? Well, the truth is the intervention is simply life. What we can do is look at how we are interacting with our kids in several different time frames and change our approaches and help our children to kind of sharpen those underdeveloped skills. So we're going to look for the next little bit at some intervention strategies. Our first strategy is a responsive strategy. This is where we are asking the question, what can I do right now? How do I respond to this child? Earlier today, I was in a meeting with many teachers, and the teacher said, you know, the way that we're reacting to these children is not working. And so internally, sort of the nerd and the trainer in me said, well, the first thing is that you're reacting. What you need to be doing is responding. And so even just sort of changing our internal focus to we're not going to react. What we're going to do is respond to this behavior and see how can we change it in the moment. That's going to be our first intervention strategy. Our second strategy is going to be proactive work. What can I do next time this situation or a similar situation arises? And we're going to spend a good deal of time talking about this because this is the strategy that really changes everything for us as parents, specifically as parents. What can I do next time? How can I create an environment that allows this child to thrive now? How can I do that? And then our third intervention strategy that we are going to look at is skill building. And this is, you know, what can I do to prepare this child for the future? Because I've consistently said that my goals for my children are this: not to call them when they are 30 years old and say, did you brush your teeth? That's my goal. I simply want them to be able to do that themselves, right? I want them to have the skills to live a productive life without having me as the mom come in and say, have you done this? What can I do in the moment? How can I respond to you, right? So our goal is to get from the responsive strategy to a place where we are mostly doing skill building. And this will certainly take time depending on the child, depending on their background, and just depending on their personality and their genetics and who this kid is. And so this is not an overnight solution to changing kids' behavior. This is really a parenting strategy to leading our children into a successful future. So what can we do in the moment? Dr. Shanker says in the self-regulation book, in the self-reg book, when a child is in distress, we feel an almost reflexive need to try to reason it away. The problem is that the systems in the brain that he or she would need to process well-intentioned reason go offline when he's hyper aroused, right? So many times as a parent, I've seen my kid sort of teetering on that place where they're about to lose it, and I want to reason it away and say, come on, we're not going to do that today, and here is why. The problem with that is, as Dr. Shanker said, we can't reason with a cortex that's not functioning at an optimal level. And so we're going to look at, well, what can we do? What can we do in the moment to help our child move from a place of dysregulation to regulation? The first part of the responsive approach is simply regulate the child. We first must help this child regulate their stress response. It absolutely has to happen first. If we go straight for the reasoning part, it's not going to work because the cortex is offline. Here is the cool thing. You don't have to do this forever. A brain-based response to dysregulated children actually builds their capacity to self-regulate. And so while for a while we will be externally regulating our children, each time we externally regulate, we are teaching our child to do it internally. The first step to externally regulating our children is to, as the adult, be regulated. You cannot regulate a child if you yourself are dysregulated, if you are out of sorts, if you are not in your own cortex, right? So if you are not able to think straight, you are not going to be able to help that child get to the place where they can think straight. We have to be regulated in order to regulate. Kids without that organized low brain, they need external regulation over and over and over. And so again, when we think about the brain, if our children have a very weak brainstem, they are going to need help regulating externally. And we want to keep doing this until they can do it themselves. Dr. Perry shares this slide. The idea of the adult regulating the child is called co-regulation. And he is showing us the opposite of the beauty of co-regulation. He's showing us the red squiggly mark of dysregulation, that things are really not okay when both adult and child are dysregulated. So what he says is this: wherever the adult is on the spectrum of arousal, from calm to straight up terror, the child that they are hoping to regulate will be several notches above them. So if I'm just at alert because I'm at school and I'm trying to get things done, my kid might be at alarm. This kid I'm trying to regulate may be several notches above me. What this means is that as the adult, we need to work very hard to stay present, to stay centered, to be as calm as possible. The more that we can regulate ourselves, the easier it will be to regulate a child. And then we can avoid things like the child escalating, needing to restrain a child, or just going into full-on crisis mode. So many challenges can be avoided if we as the adult can regulate. Now, I'm telling you this from a very calm, quiet place. Right now at 8:55 in the evening, my husband is the one at home with all of the children, right? And so for him, it may be a little more challenging to stay regulated. But the thing is, it's our job as the adult to figure out, how do I do that? And so we know it's hard. I know it's really hard when the dogs are barking, the cats are running, the children are crying, everyone is upset for you as the parent to stay regulated. But we can find some ways to do that. We can have some strategies for ourselves. The first one is self-care. And I do not mean this in the way of go get a massage or get a pedi or spend some time fishing. Those things are all wonderful and necessary. But real self-care means, are you okay? Are you okay physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally? Are you okay in your relationships? Especially in couples who are raising traumatized children together. You know, if you and your spouse are disconnected and feeling really pulled, your children will feel that. If you aren't okay, your kids aren't going to be okay. So this may be a big part of your work with helping to regulate your child. I will 100% say this is a big part of my own work in keeping my children regulated. It is for me to make sure that I am regulated, that my needs are met. The second part is just being mindful. Sometimes just taking that pause, teaching yourself, really retraining your mind to take a moment between the stimulus and the response. So yesterday, I did something a little crazy. I took three of my kids, 12 and under, to a local arcade. It's really loud in there. There's a lot of noise and lights, but we had missed doing some fun things for spring break, and I really wanted to do this, and they enjoyed it. But it was starting to get late, and one of the kids, when I said let's go, responded in a way that was less than appropriate and less than kind. And when I asked him to give me his game card to play his next game, he took it away and put it in his pocket so that I couldn't get it from him. And so in that moment, I could feel myself getting angry. I was getting angry because not only was it loud for the children, it was loud in there for me. I was getting tired. It was really late and I had worked all day and taken many children to many appointments. And I hadn't connected with my husband in a few days. We have been on opposite schedules and I was feeling a little lonely. And so in that moment, I could feel myself going towards crisis of saying, let's get out of here. Why did I even bring you here? This was a terrible idea. And what I had to do is go to the work that I've been doing for years to say, take the pause between the stimulus and the response. Okay, so I paused for a moment. I had to think about how am I going to approach this. Just pausing gave my kid enough time to go, can I play this game? Can we all play it together as a family? And then we'll leave. And so just having that mindfulness to be able to retrain myself to not react in the moment has been invaluable in my children's healing. We have to know our triggers. Knowing what they are can help you avoid them. So if your triggers are loud noises, you don't take your kids to the arcade. You can get a friend to do that. Your spouse can do it, or maybe they just don't need to go at all. And so know what your triggers are. You can avoid them for a good long time, and then maybe you'll want to start doing some work on them. And that really comes down to the fourth point there. As a parent working with a child with really intense needs, both emotionally, physically, behaviorally, we need support. That will look different for everyone. For some people, it's their spiritual community. For some folks, it's a support group. For some, it is straight up therapy. The best thing I ever did for my children was go to my own therapist. And so just learning ways for me to handle myself, to do self-care, having that person that's there for me and that I'm not going to be talking about my kids with the whole time is really very valuable. So in order to regulate, we have to be regulated. To regulate our children, we also need to slow down. Again, we are thinking about processing, right? So our children may be processing a bit slower than a typical child. We need to slow down and give our kids time. Moving quickly, speaking quickly, all of those also can provoke a threat response in our children. And we know already they have that hair trigger, right? That even something that's not scary can produce a threat response. So when we're attempting to regulate a child, just slow down your speaking and maybe even give them time. The same son that I've talked about a few times tonight went to a camp, a day camp that we have at Harmony. And one of the teachers simply wrote on his information form for the other staff, if he says no to something, give him 2 minutes. So just giving him some time, like his first reaction is, no, don't want to do that. But if you give him just a few minutes, often he has processed it, he has dealt with it, he's had some time to be more mentally flexible, and he goes and does it without even having adult interaction or redirection. Another way to regulate is to really be with your children. This is physical. This is also emotional. You know, When we are with our children and they're very, very dysregulated, we need to watch our body language. Again, we don't want to provoke that threat response. We can reflect the child's affect and reflect their body position. That really helps to calm the brain. We need to actually go and be with our children when we're giving them direction. A thing that will start chaos in my home quicker than anything else is me yelling from one room to a kid 3 rooms away, asking them to do something. It never works, and it always causes chaos. And so we really need to be with our children when we are giving them directives or when we are asking them to change their behaviors. Physically be with them, making eye contact with them, right? Dr. Karen Purvis, who wrote The Connected Child and who is the mother of the trust-based relational intervention, every photograph that I found of her with children, she was at their eye level. There is not a photo of her with a kid where she isn't being with them physically, and you can tell from her facial expression she's also with them emotionally, right? She is giving to them. She's reflecting their affect. She's reflecting back what they're giving her. And so we need to be with our children to assist them in regulation, both physically and also emotionally. Another way to regulate is through rhythmic, repetitive movement. This can be walking. That is the classic, right? The kid is having a challenge. He's getting escalated. We're going to walk it off. There's a reason we walk it off, because that bilateral stimulation actually calms the lower brain. But walking isn't the only thing we can do. We can do any kind of bilateral movement. We can do any kind of isometric exercises. Anything rhythmic will help to regulate the brain. In our family, we use music a lot. The minute that I see that a kid is escalating, we begin playing some music. We have some pretty specific songs that our kids like, and those really work well for us. Rhythmic interventions can assist in realigning that brainstem activity, reducing arousal, and improving emotional stability. Doing something like saying a poem, repeating a poem, maybe repeating a psalm or some type of verse from your spiritual tradition. That's another way to do something rhythmic, to say words in a rhythmic way. Tapping. Sometimes if my kids are getting frustrated, I'll just tap them on their shoulders, left and right. So I'll do left, then right in a pretty slow and rhythmic way. One of my kids' favorite ways to calm down, and it's completely based in the rhythm and relationship of it, is just playing Uno. A really smart guy told me recently, oh, Uno is about rhythm, right? You just go. There's not a lot of thinking. It's about colors and numbers. And if they've got that down, you can just keep going. And so even something like playing a game can be incredibly helpful for children who are very aroused and who are dysregulated. The last way that we can regulate is to simply engage with empathy. I said simply engage with empathy, but man, empathy is one of the hardest things that we have to do as parents sometimes. And so I want us to take just a second. We are going to watch another video. So I love that video. I've watched it so many times, and each time I just feel like I can take something away from that that I can use with my kids. When we are empathetic to our child, when they are distressed, even especially if it's over something we don't get or don't think is important, it assures our child they're not alone, that they are not sitting in the dirt alone, right? That we are digging in and being with them in that moment. It builds and strengthens the connections that we have with our child, and that's actually vital to making any kind of behavioral correction. You must have connection in order to give correction. And in the end, it helps us to feel closer to our children when we are able to show empathy. And so when our kids are getting really dysregulated over something that we think is really quite minor, um, showing empathy allows us to feel closer to that child. It helps to regulate them and helps to regulate us. There's a principle called the as if principle that says when we behave as if something is true, it actually creates the desired emotions. And so, yes, sometimes we are going to have trouble feeling empathetic about the kid getting the blue cup instead of the red cup. But when we can behave as if, it really creates how we think and feel and how we will interact with our children. So how does this look in action? This is a graphic from Dr. Siegel's book, The Whole Brain Child. You know, for most of us, we grew up in homes where command and demand was the norm, and it worked for many of us. You know, so this child got out of bed. He says to his mom, "Mom, you never leave me a note in the middle of the night, and I hate homework." And mom, who was probably just trying to watch Law and Order after a long day of work, said, "What are you doing out of bed? Go back to your room. I don't want to see you again till the morning." Now, I've been this mom a lot of times. And a lot of times when I am this mom, my kid explodes or my child has a meltdown or gets super dysregulated. So let's look at the bottom square. Connect and redirect. So the son says, "Mom, you never leave me a note in the middle of the night and I hate homework." And mom does a few things here. She gets in a regulating stance. She's touching this child if that's okay to do. If your child's comfortable with that, you can give them some loving touch. She's at eye level. She's really being with both physically and mentally. And she says, "You know, I get frustrated about things like that too. Would you like me to leave you a note tonight? And I've got some ideas about homework, but it's late now. So let's talk more about it tomorrow." You know, this approach is much more likely to get this child into the bed so she can finish watching TV than the first one. And so empathy in action is us really respecting our child's feelings and then being able to interact with them in a way that still lays firm boundaries. You're going to bed, but lets them know their feelings are important and real. So the second thing that we can do with our children, the second approach, is what can I do next time? And this to me is the heart of a lot of the work we do as parenting. As parents, is we have to closely, and this is super important, unemotionally examine our children's behaviors, including looking for and reducing stressors. And so again, you know, this is about observing the child, observing why was the child doing something, and taking those emotions out, taking those feelings of probably doing it to annoy me, probably doing it because they don't respect me, they don't think I'm important, they don't care about my time. When we can remove those emotions from the situation, and closely examine behaviors and look for stressors, we can create interventions that are going to make a world of difference for our children. So let's just look at the first two here, actually. So how do we, the next day, the next night, look at Victoria's behavior and analyze that to make new choices? So the first thing we do is identify the stressors. And Dr. Schenker will talks about this a lot. In fact, it really is the meat of the book Self-Reg, and I encourage you to get to that. We really don't have time to explore it in depth, but we can talk about sort of tip of the iceberg things, and then you can dig in a little deeper on your own. So the first thing we want to do as the parent is identify stressors. So just in this first one, the child didn't know what to do because she was the only one awake, right? So we identify that stressor. She didn't do it to annoy you. She didn't do it because she wants you to be miserable at 5:15. She did it because she didn't know what else to do. She was lonely, she was scared, she was having a stress response. So the first thing we want to do is identify stressors. And this can be quite complicated because we need to look at a variety of factors. So biological factors. Is there something going on physically? Is there something going on sensorially? We need to look at emotional factors, cognitive factors, social factors. So this may take some time, and it may require you to have the help of a professional. But what we want to do is get to the bottom of what is driving the behavior, identify the stressor, and then second, we want to reduce the stressor. We want to take as many of those away or reduce them as much as possible. And there's two ways we can do that. The first one is remove things. So what we might need to do is remove some things from the child's life. We may need to remove things like certain foods that set them off, triggering noises. Maybe we need to remove the overhead lights need to be off, and we need to use a lamp in the classroom. We might need to remove the child from a situation where they're surrounded by too many peers. They're getting too much stimulation. Maybe we need to reduce the noise level. So removal of stressors is one approach. And the second way is we can add things that reduce the child's stressors. So maybe we need to add some exercise to this kid's life. Maybe they can't sit still for this long. Maybe we need to add some kind of cozy corner in our bedroom so the child that's up at 5:15 can be comfortable near us, but not wake us up or have us come down and play with them at the moment. And so thinking about how can we reduce stressors, it's not just about taking things away. It may be about adding things. Do we need to give them more snacks throughout the day? Do they need water? If this kid is losing their mind on the playground, do we need to give them a cold water bottle? For my child that cannot deal with being hot, that is a huge stressor for him. For a variety of reasons, including being left in really hot places as an infant and being unable to escape. The way we deal with going into a situation where you're going to probably be physically hot is not to never go there, but to use things like a water bottle with a spray attachment so he can mist himself. We found a cloth that when you get it wet, it actually is very cold to the touch, and he can wear that around his neck or wear a hat made out of that material on his head. And so we reduce the stressors by adding things to this child's life. Now, when I talk about this, adding and removing stressors, I get one big common complaint, which is, so how am I going to prepare my child for the real world? The real world doesn't make sure we're comfortable all the time. Well, that may be true, but it's only partially true. I don't know anyone whose supervisor says, today we're going to be working outdoors at our desks doing accounting work while this construction worker is using a jackhammer next to us, right? Our employers and we as adults typically don't put ourselves into situations where we know the work we need to do can't be accomplished. So yes, I'm not going to let my son never go somewhere that's warm because he would never be outdoors. He'd always be indoors, and that's not appropriate. But what I'm going to do is give him the tools and help him now so that he can do it for himself when he is living in the quote real world. We are not coddling our children when we are defining their stressors and attempting to remove or reduce them. What we are doing is teaching them a lifelong skill. We teach this to many, many people, right? If you have a challenge with alcohol, you need the skill to know that hanging out in the bar could be a problem for you. So what I want to do is teach my kids, these are your stressors, and here are some ways we can reduce them, and here are some ways we can cope with them. And so the real world argument doesn't hold a lot of water with me. We really need to be teaching our children how to create a world where they are able to perform at the levels that are best for them. Our final part here is skill building. So we've stopped in the moment dysregulation, or we've attempted to stop that, and we've brought it down a few notches. We've spent a good deal of time looking at our children's behaviors, and this might include things like taking notes, keeping impeccable records of the types of behaviors our children have and when, and looking at them for clues, maybe going through those with a therapist or a social worker to assist you if you feel like you would have a challenge with that. And then planning, how can I pinpoint and reduce the stressors in my child's life? But the final thing is skill building. So, what can I do to prepare my kids for the future? Right? We have to practice skills in order to be good at them, like Lucy says. She has to practice waiting at the school bus if she wants to be good at waiting for the school bus. So, we're going to look at just a handful of executive functioning and self-regulation categories, and then how can we teach these skills? So how can we teach kids about self-soothing and distress tolerance? Again, the intervention is life. You're going to be doing this daily. You'll be doing this as you go about your typical business, your normal business of the day. To build self-soothing skills, you want to get kids in touch with their body. A lot of our kids are feeling very uncomfortable because they have sensory issues, because they may be very tired, but they don't know that's what's wrong. So we have to help our kids really get in touch with their bodies. So so we could talk to our child maybe about, okay, so you started getting upset and you had a meltdown. So at the very beginning of that, where did you feel that in your body? The more that we can talk about that, the more that we can narrate that. So when I'm in traffic and I'm getting really, really frustrated, I'll tell my kids, I'm starting to feel really frustrated. I know that because I feel it in my shoulders. The shoulders are going up around my ears. So get kids in touch with their body. As soon as they know something's up, they can learn how to cope. Model and teach those coping skills, right? Sit with kids in their pain and distress. A thing that I say to my kids a lot is ride the wave, right? Ride the wave. I know you're very sad, you're very angry, you're very upset, but we can ride the wave. Feelings don't last forever. So, I'm not going to say that when they're throwing shoes at me or pounding on the wall. I'm going to be using a regulating technique at that point. But later on, when we go back to talk about this, or when we're riding in the car to an appointment, we can talk about, yep, sometimes you're really sad. A few weeks ago, I got really sad and I was crying at church. And my son kept saying, "Stop crying, Mom, stop crying." And I just said to him, "I'm really sad and I can take good care of you. Being sad is okay. We're going to ride this wave. I won't be sad forever." So we can teach kids and narrate to them that, yep, we're going to have big feelings, but they pass, and we can self-soothe. We can also use things like a calm down box with coping skills inside, things like bubbles or chewing gum, whatever it is that works for your child's sensory tools. But the child has to know when to use it. So that's that getting in touch with what's uncomfortable, how do I feel? And then finally, we want to microdose positive stress, right? So we want our kids to have a little bit of positive stress. We have to be super observant to know where the breaking point is, though. We don't want to push them past that breaking point. And so with my son who doesn't like to be in the heat, I might say on the way home, we'll just stop at the park for about 5 minutes. And if it's warm, I'll say, you know what, if you get too warm, we can go back in 4 minutes. So I'm giving him little tiny micro doses of a stressor that's not going to overwhelm him, but it's going to just open that window of tolerance, and we'll be narrating the whole time. So I might even be saying, and he's 12, I might be saying, "Ugh, you're really sweaty. Looks like you're getting hot. How are you holding up?" And so I'm narrating a lot with that. How can we help our kids manage emotions? We have to teach them what emotions are. We have to label emotions. This is really ongoing with my children who range from 8 now to 16. Even with the 16-year-old, this is pretty new. I'm labeling a lot of new emotions for this child, and talking to them about, you may feel like this one minute and another way another minute. That's okay. Our feelings are normal. They pass like clouds in the sky. We're going to label all of these emotions. Problem solving doesn't come naturally to many of our kids. We have to actively teach that. So again, once the problem is passed, maybe my two children were fighting about leaving the arcade. Maybe tomorrow I'll reflect and say, we had such a good time at the arcade. I wonder how we could get out of there more quickly next time, because that seemed a little stressful. And then I can actively teach problem solving. It seemed like you were feeling really stressed about leaving or upset about leaving. So what can we do? And then we can put these into place. Really collaborating with our children teaches them how to solve problems on their own. If they only get my solution, they will never learn how to create their own solution. We also have to live like Dora the Explorer. I know Dora is not really in the culture as much right now, but Dora labeled everything. So she would say, first we're going to the field, next to the mountain, and then to Abuela's house. We really have to live like that with our kids. We have to tell them what we are doing so that they can manage their emotions. So I will say, our plan today is to do this. We're going to go to the library, then go to lunch, and then come home and play with our tablets. Over and over and over. This helps them manage their behavior because they know what is next. I still do this with my 12-year-old because not knowing is really, really stressful for him. And then we can create an emotional vocabulary for our children using media, things like books. You see the feelings books and the feelings flashcards there by Todd Parr. Those are great for younger children. And then using more cultural, pop culture references with our older children. My daughter sends me memes that tell me how she's feeling. I totally don't get meme culture, but I know how she's feeling because she sends me these things. She'll send me songs, and we've created an emotional vocabulary. She and I had this amazing conversation at the end of last week where we were listening to a song, and she said, "It makes me feel happy and sad at the same time." And she's like, "I don't know how to describe that." And I said, "Actually, I think you've done a great job. And I'm going to play this song for you because this song makes me feel both happy and sad at the same time." So we're creating this emotional vocabulary through the things that we just come in contact with each day. Books, movies, music, right? All of those can create this emotional vocabulary. Using rhythmic interventions can really assist in realigning the brainstem and reduce arousal and improve emotional stability. So as we said, we can use rhythmic interventions for actual situations where we need to quickly regulate, but we can use ongoing rhythmic interventions to help our children to get their brains more regulated, more stable. So this is actually a picture of my son many years ago doing homework on a swing. He's getting the homework done. The boundary isn't being broken. The homework needs to be done, but we're doing it in a way that meets his needs. This is the real world. It's us getting stuff done while meeting his needs. And there's tons of ways that you can do this. You can see the list. Lots and lots of movement helps to realign that brainstem and get our kids back on a trajectory where they are able to better regulate their emotions and behaviors. When I see kids that are just up and very impulsive, the first thing we do is some physical activity. So right before we go into a place they need to sit for a long time, there's a lot of physical activity. They may just be doing something as simple as pushing on the wall outside of the dentist office before they have to sit in the chairs for a while. They may be doing something like, I pound out a quick rhythm on my knees and they respond back to me with it in the car before we have to go and sit in a meeting. So physical activity helps a lot. Breathing techniques can really, really regulate children emotionally and behaviorally. And there are tons of different techniques, but the easiest ones for children are simply to breathe in, puff out your cheeks like a fish, and then slowly let the air out. So even something as simple as a breathing technique that you do daily can help increase that awareness of how it feels to be in control emotionally. For mental flexibility, the first thing is we have to be flexible. If we are inflexible as parents, our children will not have the ability to be flexible. We have to be flexible. We have to play. Play teaches that mental flexibility, but we may need to play with our children because, again, children who have gone through a lot of abuse and neglect have real challenges in that area. And we have to think outside the box and teach our children to do the same thing. My favorite thing to do with my kids to build mental flexibility is just driving around, and I say to them, look around and tell me one place you could work when you are older. And so they'll look around and they'll say, McDonald's, great. And then we'll look at another building and say, what do you think happens in there? So we're building these skills of thinking quickly and thinking flexibly. Asking them, what could you do with this object? Maybe I think of a Pringles can. Just taking it to the kids and go, what could you make from this? And having them tell you a few things. Just being flexible. And then finally, teaching our kids goal-directed behaviors. This is all about the art of the reframe, right? The child didn't fail. They are taking something away from this experience that they can build on for next time. Teaching them to self-monitor. One of my children still needs to do this a lot. And what we do is have an alarm on his watch that goes off about every 5 minutes. And that just reminds him, check in. Am I doing what I'm supposed to do? Am I where I'm supposed to be? It helps him to learn to self-monitor so that he can do that for larger behaviors. And then, of course, just teaching organization through things like storytelling. This is really connecting, and it's building our kids' brains. So I tell stories every few nights about what our cats have done when we are away from home. They're very silly stories, and the kids love them. They're very funny. Even my teenager will occasionally chuckle at my silly stories. But what I'm doing is teaching, beginning, middle, end, how things are organized. These skills build our children's brains so that they will be able to organize themselves and reach their goals. I would be happy to send you more activities in these areas if you'd like that. The handout, the outline from this presentation is in the handouts box there. So you can also print that off and take it with you if you would like to do some of your own thinking and writing and think of the ideas that you would like to share with your children. So I really appreciate you guys joining me tonight, looking at these strategies of what can I do in the moment, how can I plan for next time, and what can I just do during the day that really builds my kids' skills and prepares them for the future. We want to teach our children self-regulation skills by being regulated ourselves. And I really hope that tonight helped you to regulate and that you will have a great day with your families tomorrow. Thanks so much, and be looking for your certificates.